Today we are reviewing a submitted political report covering the recent governmental reactions to the dismissal of indictments against Force 100 soldiers in the Sde Teiman affair.
Grounding the reader in the factual origins of a controversy is essential before detailing the political fallout.
The piece does a really incredible job capturing the highly charged political rhetoric right out of the gate, but let's just dive right into the feedback.
Yeah, because right now the piece kind of assumes the reader already knows everything about the original Sde Teiman affair.
Which is a pretty massive assumption.
It really is. It focuses entirely on the aftermath and, the political quotes from figures like Katz and Ben-Gvir.
Right. We get all these massive, explosive reactions from the political tier.
Exactly. But the text totally neglects to explain the original allegations against Force 100.
Or even why the military advocate general brought the indictments in the first place.
Right, which creates a huge cognitive burden. When you drop a reader into the middle of a political firestorm without establishing the underlying facts, you inadvertently turn them into a passive recipient of political spin.
Because they have no anchor.
Exactly. No anchor at all. They're reading these intense expressions of vindication or outrage, but they possess no objective yardstick to measure that rhetoric against.
Yeah. It's like reviewing a movie sequel without, explaining what happened in the first film.
Oh, wow. I love that analogy. That is spot on.
Right. Like the audience feels the intense emotion of the actors on screen, but they completely lack the plot to understand why anyone is shouting.
They feel the heat, but they have no light.
So it's really an issue of cognitive load. If I'm burning all my mental energy just trying to guess what the original crime or incident was,
you don't have the bandwidth to critically analyze the rhetoric being presented to you.
Exactly. So what's the suggestion here? How do we actually fix this on the page?
Well, the piece would benefit immensely from integrating a concise, objective summary of the original incident.
Just laying out the baseline reality.
Yeah, the incident and the legal reasoning behind the initial indictments. You have to anchor these political reactions to reality.
So the audience has the necessary context to weigh the minister's statements.
Rather than just swallowing them whole. Exactly.
Let's look at some concrete examples of how this plays out in the text.
Sure. So early in the draft, we get a section discussing Minister Katz, where he refers to the criminal investigation methods.
And he explicitly calls the investigation a blood libel.
Right. And how can a reader independently evaluate whether the term blood libel is an accurate assessment or just political hyperbole if they don't know the military advocate general's original legal framework?
They can't.
They can't. So to actually fix this on the page, the writer needs to step in and build some scaffolding.
Like a brief factual paragraph right before introducing Minister Katz's quote?
Yes. Explicitly explain what Force 100 was accused of doing at the facility. Briefly define what those criminal investigation methods are that Katz is referring to.
So we are essentially giving the reader the tools to analyze the quote themselves.
Exactly. You construct a narrative scaffolding that supports the heavy weight of the political rhetoric that follows. You are empowering the reader.
You aren't telling them Katz is right or wrong.
No, you're saying, here is what happened, and here is how the minister is characterizing it.
That friction between the objective event and the subjective political reaction is where the actual journalism happens.
That is the journalism. Yes.
Well, that clears up the foundational issue perfectly. So once you've anchored the reader with those baseline facts, the real work begins.
Transforming a sequential list of quotes into a thematic narrative significantly elevates the analytical depth of the writing.
Because you can't just drop those facts next to a chronological list of quotes and expect the reader to connect the dots.
You have to actively build the architecture of the argument. This requires us to examine how the piece actually organizes these reactions.
Right, and currently the draft reads a bit like a bulletin board of press releases.
It really does. It moves so mechanically down the line. Minister Katz says this, then Minister Ben-Gvir says that.
Followed by Minister Karhi, and finally, Minister Gamliel.
It's just a chronological listing that fails to synthesize any of their shared underlying arguments.
We get all the voices, but we don't get the strategy behind the voices.
And this is a very common trap, When you list quotes sequentially like that, you are essentially functioning as a stenographer.
Just taking the raw data and dumping it onto the page.
Exactly.
Which subtly transfers the burden of synthesis entirely onto the reader. You are asking your audience to do the hard work of figuring out how these quotes relate to one another.
Right. The piece needs the writer to take the reins, group the reactions by the institutions they are attacking rather than simply listing them speaker by speaker.
So guide the reader through the political landscape by identifying the overarching strategies at play.
Yes, let's workshop what that actually looks like in practice.
Yeah, how do we take this list and turn it into something structural?
Look at what the ministers are actually targeting in their rhetoric. You can combine Minister Katz and Minister Ben-Gvir's statements under a synthesized, explicit theme.
Like putting them in a specific bucket.
Exactly. For instance, you could introduce a section conceptually framed around executive attacks on the judicial system.
Oh, I see. And within that specific thematic bucket, you highlight their shared targeting of the former military advocate general and attorney general Gali Bahar Miara.
Yes, so instead of just saying Katz was mad and Ben-Gvir was also mad,
we are showing the reader that this is a coordinated rhetorical assault on the legal establishment.
Precisely. And once you've established that first theme, you can explicitly transition to Minister Karhi's quote.
But instead of it just being the next item on a list, you frame it as a distinct, deliberate shift.
Right, toward an attack on the media. His demand for Channel 12 to apologize is no longer just another random complaint.
It becomes a separate, clearly defined pillar of the government's broader reactive strategy.
Exactly.
I see the value in that structural shift. It moves the piece from basic reporting to advanced political analysis.
It does. But let me push back on this idea for a moment, just putting myself in the writer's shoes.
Sure, go ahead.
Is there a risk that by restructuring and combining these individual quotes into these larger thematic buckets, I might accidentally strip away the individual nuances of each minister's statement?
Ah, that is a phenomenal question.
Like, if I lump Katz and Ben-Gvir together under a broad anti-judiciary ban, do I lose the unique flavor or the specific grievance of their individual politics?
That addresses a very real fear writers have when they begin to synthesize raw material. They worry that summarizing means flattening.
Exactly.
But the reality is actually the exact opposite. When executed correctly, thematic grouping highlights those individual nuances far better than a list ever could.
Wait, really? How does it highlight them? Think about how contrast works visually. If I place a dark blue square next to a light blue square, you immediately notice the subtle difference in their shades.
Right?
But if I place them on opposite sides of a crowded room, they both just register as blue.
Oh, wow. So by placing them in the same thematic environment, their differences become the focal point.
Precisely. By placing Katz and Ben-Gvir next to each other within the same thematic framework, the attack on the judiciary, the reader is now perfectly positioned to notice how they differ in their execution.
You might point out that one uses highly formal institutional language to undermine the courts, while the other uses populist, inflammatory language.
Yes. The thematic bucket creates a controlled environment where those subtle, individualized rhetorical choices shine much brighter than they would in a disconnected mechanical list.
You aren't flattening their voices.
No, you are organizing the gallery so the distinct brushstrokes of each painting are easier to compare side by side.
That makes a lot of sense. The structure itself acts as a magnifying glass for the analysis.
Exactly.
And you know, when you actually organize the piece by these institutional targets, something interesting happens. You suddenly realize that one of these quotes doesn't fit into those buckets at all.
Highlighting the intersection of public policy and personal connections provides a far more compelling angle than treating every quote as standard political messaging.
It stands out so much, and that anomaly is actually the most fascinating part of the entire draft.
Even though it's currently buried at the very end.
Right. We are talking about Minister Gila Gamliel's statement. The draft includes her praise for her husband and brother-in-law,
Attorneys Havav and Ephraim Damari,
who notably represented the Force 100 soldiers pro bono. But the text just drops this detail in the final paragraph without any editorial framing.
It's treated like a piece of standard boiler political messaging.
It feels like an abrupt PR addition rather than a vital, deeply revealing piece of information.
I gotta say, when I first read that detail, my immediate thought was, why is this buried at the bottom of the page?
Right?
This is the most original, striking detail in the entire draft. The piece needs to actively use this quote to explore the deeply intertwined nature of Israeli politics and legal defense.
So frame this familial connection as an intriguing, highly relevant piece of color.
Yes, that highlights exactly how close the political tier is to the specific legal battle. This isn't just a generic statement of support from a politician.
No, it's a revelation of intense personal proximity. It really is a striking collision of worlds.
You have the political and the personal colliding right there on the page.
But from a purely mechanical writing standpoint, I have to admit some hesitation on behalf of the writer.
Okay.
If I am trying to maintain a completely objective, straight-down-the-middle journalistic tone, calling out a minister's husband feels a bit loaded.
It can, yeah.
How can the writer present this familial connection neutrally? How do you explicitly point out that a minister's family is defending the soldiers without sounding accusatory or like you are trying to weave a conspiracy theory?
That's a crucial distinction, and tone calibration here is everything. The fear of sounding biased often causes writers to underreport highly significant details.
They overcorrect.
Exactly, but look at the evidence. Is the connection between the minister's family and the defense fully established in the material?
Yes, she states it publicly herself.
Right. So the trick to remaining completely neutral while still highlighting the significance is to rely entirely on proximity and precision. You have to completely avoid prescriptive or loaded adverbs.
Meaning, avoid telling the reader how to feel about the connection.
Exactly. You do not write, suspiciously, the minister's husband.
Or, conveniently, her family stepped in.
Right. That's where you cross the line into opinion. Instead, you simply place the undeniable facts directly next to each other and allow the friction between them to generate the heat.
Give me an example of how that sentence should look.
You could write something along the lines of, in a unique convergence of the political and legal spheres, Minister Gamliel's statement highlighted that her immediate family provided pro bono representation for the soldiers, underscoring the intimate proximity between the cabinet's political messaging and the legal defense room.
That's incredibly effective. You are just holding up a mirror to the reality of the situation.
You are telling the reader, look at how close these two worlds are.
You aren't telling them it's corrupt.
No, you aren't saying it's inappropriate. You're simply pointing out that it is deeply interconnected. You have to trust the reader to understand the weight of that connection once you present the facts clearly.
By letting the facts do the heavy lifting, the writer preserves their credibility as an objective synthesizer while still delivering a highly sophisticated, original angle.
It's about having the confidence to point at the unique detail without feeling the need to scream about it.
I love that.
I often think of the writer's role as being a tour guide in a historic building. You shine the flashlight on the interesting architecture.
You point out the hidden doorways.
Right. But you don't need to tell the tourists how to feel about the building. Just show them where the interesting things are and let them experience the impact for themselves.
And when the writer just pasted Gamliel's quote at the end of the text, they weren't shining a light on anything.
They were just handing the tourists a map and walking away.
Yeah, the difference between stenography and editorial authority really is the defining theme of this entire review.
It really is.
Whether it's providing the factual baseline at the beginning, categorizing the quotes by their institutional targets in the middle, or framing a highly personal revelation at the end, it all comes down to the writer taking control of the narrative space.
And the foundational writing in this draft is already so strong. The capture of the rhetoric is sharp.
The selection of the quotes is comprehensive.
Right. The raw materials to build a phenomenal, top-tier political analysis are all sitting right there on the page. It just requires that next layer of editorial intervention to unlock its full potential.
Well, this has been an incredibly productive breakdown. So to quickly recap the 3 main actionable takeaways for the listener to implement in their next draft.
Number 1.
First, anchor the quotes with factual context. Do not assume the reader knows the original Sde Teiman allegations. Provide that brief, objective baseline early on so the audience can properly evaluate the ensuing political rhetoric without suffering from cognitive overload.
Number 2.
Second, restructure the flow by thematizing the political reaction. Group the quotes by their institutional targets, like the judiciary or the media, rather than listing them chronologically.
This immediately elevates the analytical depth of the narrative and highlights the nuances between the different ministers.
Exactly. And third, editorially frame Minister Gamliel's family connection. Don't just drop it in as a final thought. Use it to add a unique, original angle that explores the intimate intersection of the political and legal sphere.
Because ultimately, you never want your reader walking into the sequel blind. Give them the plot, group the action, and show them exactly why the screen is on fire.